Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 2. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone, and I'm joined by the other co-host Will Porter. Will, how you doing today?
Good, man. How you doing, Kyle? Good to be with you again.
Yeah, I'm doing well. Just a few announcements as we start the show today. The Conflicts of Interest feed is up on iTunes. We got approval, so people could start subscribing to the show and leaving ratings and reviews there. The ratings and reviews are, big early on too. That way, if you got a couple, it looks like, more of a legit show. So, people who really like it and, are going to definitely give 5 stars, go out there and go ahead and give us a rating and review. Subscribe to the show if you can. Unsubscribe from the old Foreign Policy Focus feed, but you're too lazy to do that. I'm sure eventually your phone will stop downloading those episodes, and then I'll have an idea of when people are done using that feed. So make sure you do that, and then subscribe to the YouTube channel. We've had a pretty good number of people subscribe already. We got like one episode in the bank and over 60 subscribers. It'd be cool if we have like 100 by the end of the week. So if you're by any chance listening on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. From looking at the number of people who watched the first episode, we have a whole lot more watchers than subscribers. So make sure you do that. And Will, do we have anything else, or should we just get into the news today?
I think that does it for all the housekeeping stuff. Let's just get into the stories.
So the first story we have today is something that certainly sounds like something that would come about in the age of Donald Trump, and that is Quad-NATO, or the Quad, which is going to be a NATO-like treaty, and it seems to be designed to counter China, as the U.S. is looking to involve India, Australia, and Japan. This is a pretty diverse group of nations here, Will, and a pretty bold, style alliance. I mean, NATO is, it has the Article 5, you attack one, you attack them all. That's some big security and defense commitments. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I do think it's interesting to see this Quad thing developing. It was founded back in 2007. I think it was largely a project of Shinzo Abe, the Japanese prime minister, or no longer. I guess he just recently stepped down. But as far as I understand, it was sort of his brainchild in developing this idea for this Quad alliance. And Dick Cheney at the time too, the vice president at the time, was also had a hand in creating it, as you might not be surprised to hear. I thought it was interesting though. I was reading this column recently in a Korean newspaper where it was written in 2008, pretty soon after this thing was founded. And the author was being, pretty critical of this whole project. And he was saying how, no one's really has a big interest in being antagonistic toward China now. This thing's probably just going to fade away and disappear. And it kind of looked like it might. Like there was a point where I think Australia had bowed out, where there was some tension between them and India over uranium sales or something. And it did kind of look like the thing was going to fall apart. But that did not happen. And yeah, this week, that columnist was proven more wrong than ever, I guess, because now you do have the State Department saying they would like to formalize this thing into something like a NATO, which right now the Quad is more just like a cooperative mutual defense, or excuse me, a cooperative military forum, I should say. But what they want to make it into is a mutual defense pact, was what it sounds like, where if one member is attacked, then the others will come, go to war in their defense. Kind of that's how the NATO Article 5 thing works. So it sounds like that's sort of the direction they want to take this thing with this Quad. And I have heard this thing referred to before as the Asian NATO, already. And so I guess they really just want to formalize that nickname for it.
Right. Well, one of the things that jumps out to me is, of course, the inclusion of India in this. The U.S. already has, I believe, defense pacts with both Japan and Australia. There's I believe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, U.S. treaty that ties them all together, and they do naval drills. And then the U.S. has had the defense guarantee of Japan from World War II. So, those two exist. But India, the second biggest by population country in the world, what is not, I don't think, correctly in the name of democracy, but it's called the world's largest democracy. Right now, it's ruled by a everybody calls him a right-wing fascist. I think in the age of Trump, that doesn't sound like a whole lot of anything, but I think the way I most accurately, see Modi, who is the prime minister, is something like a Netanyahu. in Israel, who is very much for his sector. He really goes towards like the Hindu nationalist base, and makes a living off of demonizing the Muslims, but rather in the Kashmir region than the West Bank. And then there's 100 something million Muslims in India as is. I think it's like the actually second or third largest Muslim population country, which is crazy when you could figure the Muslims are like 10% of the population in that country. So to
Right.
be such a large population but such a minority is huge. And then there's the region of Kashmir and Jammu and the disputed border region along the Himalayas with China. They're just such complicating factors, and it really involved this government and this army in some pretty nasty war crimes, the ongoing occupation of Kashmir, while gets even a fraction of a coverage that the plight of the Palestinians does is significant. And then one of the things that we know about NATO is it guarantees you priority and like the super US weapon sales. If you're a NATO ally,
Right.
we'll pretty much sell you anything. Maybe not Predator drones to all NATO allies, but I can't imagine what else we really wouldn't sell one of these Patriot missiles, F-35s. We'll sell it all if you're a NATO member. And so I would be very concerned about the U.S. getting into deeper ties with India specifically here. And then also that India has so many disputed borders. I mean, the main one we could talk about here is with China. And in fact, within the past day, there were reports of India having to carry out some maneuvers because they say China was trying to take a strategic hill along the border.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's a mistranslation there, like if they're really going after a hill or if it was, like a mountaintop or something, which is usually the kind of thing that, these two are fighting over, not something as significant as a hill. But, this is what we're talking about here. And the U.S. just seems like, especially in the age of Trump, when there doesn't seem to maybe be as refined foreign policy thinking by the president as there would be, by Obama. I think he had like the ability to ask a little bit more questions about this kind of thing and maybe realize really what he was getting himself into. I think Trump is walking into a real mess right here, and he really probably doesn't get like all the geopolitical problems, including with states that the U.S. is allied with, like Pakistan. So I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this, or if you think it's quite bad of an idea as I do.
Yeah, yeah, I tend to agree. And if you listen to what because I think the specific State Department official, we talked about him on the last show, on the first show, I believe, of conflicts of interest. We talked about the Deputy Secretary of State, Stephen Biegun, and what he was saying too, in addition to saying sort of this is like a move to be they want to create this thing, make this thing into a bulwark against the Chinese. He was also saying that at some point they'd like to expand this thing to include South Korea and Vietnam and New Zealand as well. So they're even talking about like getting more ambitious with this thing. And yeah, sort of South Korea already serves that for purpose. It's like a huge American, military base there right next to China. However, one thing I was going to point out, and sort of, I'm curious if like I think the current Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, I think he tends to track with the U.S. position on China, which is mostly hostile. And then, of course, as you're mentioning, the India's position on China right now is really sort of things are really heating up between them. You mentioned that border dispute just this week that's kind of escalating again. And back in June, they had like a big clash. I think it was like their biggest clash in decades, where a couple dozen people I think died on both sides, soldiers. I think it was just like a hand-to-hand thing. But so we know for a fact, though, that the Australians and the Indians have a fairly hostile relationship toward China. But something I'm not really aware of is like, do you have an impression of like what the feeling is in Japan toward the Chinese? Like I know they have sort of a history, a rough history that goes back. They haven't always got along, and I don't know. Maybe you don't know. That's fine. But I'm just curious if you get some impression of what their sort of stance would be on this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think Japan would. That's at least under the Abe administration. Now things may change going forward. I know that there is like a real contingent in Japan of people for like the peace-ish movement and stuff like that. And so I hope it would go that direction, and that maybe the incoming prime minister is going to really, kind of push to undo some of the stuff that Abe has done. But, Japan's in like kind of a complicated situation because after World War II, the U.S. forced them to accept like a peace constitution. And so, essentially they didn't have a military at all and were, dependent on the U.S. for defense. Even, up until very recently, a lot of people might not realize this, Japan was the world's second largest economy. And so this is a massive booming economy, but at the same time they have, absolutely no defense. And then China's a, massive and growing economy and is now larger than Japan, I guess. You can imagine how that would work among the American populace, right? If there was, this country right next door that got really, really, really big and economically powerful, and then was building up a military deterrent against your ally. I guess it made sense to me that there's a lot of angst in Japan and feeling of like we have to be able to deter the Chinese. And then there are disputes. So one of the interesting things I was going to point out is that, when you initially talk about this Quad-NATO alliance thing, India, has land disputes with China, but I don't think has any maritime boundary disputes with China, and neither does Australia, where Japan has a couple, but not. It's not like with Vietnam or the Philippines or Malaysia, where there's significant, maritime boundary differences. And, that on the last episode, there's show we're talking about all this conflict in the South China Sea, and then Taiwan claims a whole bunch of this territory too, which complicates the hell out of things. Yeah, so my sense would be is that Japan would be like one of the drivers of this. Although again, with the like recent tensions with India, I'm sure they're more willing than ever to get involved here. And I don't know. I thought that was one of the other really interesting things about this proposed alliance was just, is this just a naval thing? Because in a sense, it seems like that's where all the coordination is between these countries. But at the same time, at least when it comes to India, a land conflict is far, far more likely than a naval one. And so I guess I have a feeling that India wouldn't just commit to like coming to the aid in a naval conflict because it's unlikely that they would get in a naval conflict with China, and then would also expect the U.S. and all U.S., Australia, and Japan to enter into a war with China should, India feel like China invaded India. And I mean, the way these borders work and everything, China could claim to be on Chinese territory while India says that they've invaded India by 50 miles in some places.
Right.
And so I think it's a very dangerous thing. But again, one of the reasons I thought it was really important to talk about this is it seems to me like the kind of thing that might appeal to Donald Trump. I think it's going to work for weapon sales. I think he's going to get like a big, celebratory thing out of it. I'm sure it will.
Deal, yeah.
Right. I'm sure that the to the people who feel like, oh, maybe Donald Trump's a little bit of a racist if he's up there holding hands with whoever the Japanese prime minister is and Modi, well, that's kind of a, good diverse image look that he has, and shaking hands, like having the Crown Prince or whoever from Dubai, MBZ, having him sign a deal with the Israelis. It makes it seem like Trump, probably isn't that much of a bigot if he's able to like work out a deal with all these people. So I think, all those things are kind of going to go into this. And I know Modi is heavy on flattery of Trump, and like he seems to be one of these guys, kind of like who's the prime minister of Poland or the president of Poland who's like, we'll build Fort Trump, right? Like, they kind of get that if you roll out the red carpet, and Modi had this massive rally for Trump, even as the coronavirus thing was getting going, to celebrate Trump coming to the country. And it was like 100% about Trump, Netanyahu putting up billboards with him and Trump shaking hands. I think all of this is to flatter the president's ego. And I might work a little bit, which is the concerning part of me. So, and again,
easily moved.
and then the other thing about it too is I think this is kind of where we're at with not only Trump, but the whole U.S. populace in general. Quad-NATO sounds kind of cool. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It sounds like Sharknado or something that, you would see on TV these days. And, I think people are just dying to like tweet something out and, have a nice catchy hashtag. So I think we're going to be talking about this into the future. Well, I don't think this is the last time. And if the U.S. starts selling these countries, especially India, a whole bunch of advanced weapons, I think China's going to take notice. Right, interesting report from the Pentagon saying that they believe China to have in the low number of 200s of nuclear weapons, but that they're expecting China to double those nuclear warheads over the next 10 years. A couple, parts about that story that are particularly interesting is that if China has in the low 200s of nukes, which I would guess is under 225, 230, then they have about 100 less nukes than everybody assessed them to have. The number's long been over 300 at about 320 to 350. And so, and the Pentagon didn't give a hard number on what doubling meant. And so if it's in the low 200s and, the Pentagon saying they're going to go to 400, that's really not much of a bump over the 320 nukes that everybody was fine with China having before. But the way all the stories are written are very sensational. And I think it's going to, if you see a story about, hey, we're coming up with this possibly new NATO ideal to combat China, and then you see next China's going to double their nuclear arsenal, you think, oh my God. Well, China's nuclear arsenal is a 20th of just the United States. They possess like 2% or 3% of the world's nuclear weapons. And yeah, it's presented like they have this massive growing nuclear arsenal that must be combated. And hell, we got this Quad-NATO thing right here that we could roll out for everybody. So
Right.
yeah, there's a lot going on here. Will, do you have anything else on it?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, just to piggyback on something you said, I do wonder if the stuff they're rolling out about the Chinese doubling their nuclear arsenal and stuff, I wonder if they're trying to kind of prime the pump, because as we recently talked about on our previous show, Foreign Policy Focus, the U.S. position is now changed on the New START deal, where before they were trying to force the Chinese into this agreement to sort of limit their nuclear arsenal, and now they're saying that they're going to try to negotiate a separate arms control deal with the Chinese. So I wonder if they're kind of like, putting together their position to say the Chinese are doubling their arsenal, and they're just trying to like assemble this argument that, I don't know, maybe they're priming the pump for that. So that'd be my last thought on the Quad-NATO deal.
Yeah, that's a good point. When the propaganda has dual meanings, it's very effective, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I want to move next to this story that really rolled out last week, I guess, Will, where we had a collision in Syria between U.S. and Russian forces. And maybe just give us a little bit of the background. And I will say, for anybody watching the YouTube, me and Will are going to play a clip. It's about 1 minute and 40 seconds. No sound, of just what I think the Russians put out of the alleged, or the actual collision that left 4 Americans injured.
Right. Yeah. So in this incident, I mean, like the sort of the background just basically is, the Russians are still, in Syria. They're helping the president there, the government of Bashar al-Assad to, beat back the remnants of these rebel groups. And so they carry out these patrols. And the United States is also occupying Syrian territory, where we're mostly embedded with Kurdish groups, like without the permission of the government. And so we're also doing patrols of our own. And so what we ended up having last Tuesday was these, like, a Russian and American patrol, met. And you did have some kind of like collision or car wreck, as you're saying. And for the viewers, they can see now what sort of this happening, this incident. I believe the Russians actually put out this footage like almost right away after the incident occurred. And the Pentagon actually did not comment on this for like several days after it happened, maybe even like half a week or something. But honestly, in some of the footage, like I couldn't make total heads or tails out of what we're seeing. In the footage we're watching now, it does appear that the American vehicle does collide with the Russian one. But like I can't totally, the angles are kind of odd, like to where I can't totally tell who actually ran into whom. Of course, the Americans claim the complete opposite of what the video appears to show. It appears to show that the American vehicle is colliding with the Russian one, but the Americans claim the opposite. They say the Russians rammed an American vehicle, and then like pursued them and did all this other like, hostile and provocative stuff. And that this is, of course, in their statement that they put out just recently about this. There was sort of a delay. But again, there's a couple different clips of this, and I couldn't fully make out heads or tails of like what we're actually looking at here, of what we're seeing in terms of who might be the aggressor. In one of the clips, it does the Americans say that the Russians pursued their vehicles, whereas in the clip that we're watching, it does kind of look like the Americans are pursuing the Russians, where at one point the Russians even kind of pull ahead of the American vehicles, and it seems like they're trying to get away or something. But I don't know, like maybe what was your take on these videos? What did you think?
Yeah, well, my first thought was it's just, people talk about, Americans on the streets like engaging in like this really stupid form of LARPing. For people who watch the video, there's like multiple military helicopters flying around. If you look, you see probably a total of 6 vehicles in the shot. 2 or 3 are Americans and 2 or 3 are Russians, and they're just driving around in this field in Syria and like kind of weaving in and out of each other. And it's just the stupidest thing. What does any of this have to do with us? What part of or what American is at risk if the U.S. isn't carrying out these maneuvers in Syria? It's obvious that nobody is, and that this is just a big theater game. But the problem is the risk is that if these troops start shooting at each other, it very easily spirals to a situation where we're at confrontation with Russia, and then that's a step away from nuclear annihilation of the entire planet. It's the stupidest thing going on. People could sit there and talk about, armed Antifa versus armed white militants on the streets being
Blue boys.
yeah, right, like that. Obviously that's a very tense situation, and talking about like the potential like fallout from that standoff. I mean, this is a hell of a lot worse than that. And the reaction from so many people, especially from people within the US media, is to basically say, why isn't Donald Trump doing about this? Why won't he confront Vladimir Putin? Why is he a puppet of Vladimir Putin? And just going into this complete Russiagate tirade and completely lost and devoid from any kind of reality of this situation, that this is some field out in the middle of nowhere Syria. At the very best, what the US is going to do is pump a little bit of oil from the ground and spill a hell of a lot more in the process. There's no reason to be here. It's not helping anyone. The best thing we could do is let Russia and the Syrian government take this territory so the Kurds can't, or not the Kurds, the Turkey can't, and that way the Kurds have some form of protection, and we're not leaving them open to another ethnic cleansing and slaughter. But instead, we're playing these stupid games with the Russians. The Turkey is trying to exploit the chaos and do as much as they can in Syria. And it's going to be the people that everybody claims to care about most, the Kurds, that are, I think, really going to suffer and end up getting the short end. And then of course a potential risk to the U.S. Russian relationship. I will say is at times like this, when you sit here and you go, well, thank God Hillary Clinton isn't president. Not that I'm happy at all that Donald Trump is, but this lady wanted confrontation with Russia in Syria, and playing bumper cars to her is a excuse for a no-fly zone to start a war, and at least Trump is willing to ignore it. So that's the best we get, I guess, out of a President Donald Trump, is that occasionally he'll just let things go rather than reacting to every last incident. But I agree with you on like the video analysis that I had a hard time telling exactly who was running into who, in part because there's not like clear road lines or anything like that. They're just kind of
in a field.
Yeah, it looks like they're driving around a field, and they're all in these very large military vehicle that I'm sure weighs several tons and stuff like that. And it looks like they're driving relatively quickly. I was also thinking to myself, and maybe this is just empty territory, but it looked like a farmer's field. It looked like it had, been plowed and stuff like that. Like, how much damage to the Syrian economy is this doing? I'm not saying that this one time driving through some guy's field and, taking out 2% of his crops is going to do the damage, but this isn't the first time that something like this has happened. where we've had the U.S. and Russian forces run into each other, our U.S. and Syrian forces run into each other. And I don't think it's uncommon that our patrols run into each other in these areas. And then you're driving, I'm guessing, through fields like this and stuff. It must feel like just the absolute, just being like the gum on the bottom of somebody's shoe to be the Syrians right now, and having the
Right.
Russians and the Americans playing your territory like this. It's so dangerous. And, of course, if anything does start to happen, initially the US and Russia will probably try to play it out locally, and it'll be the Syrian people that are already suffering from US sanctions, from 2011 is about to start. So 9 years of civil war
Yeah.
ish in that country. I say ish because the U.S. bat that opposition so heavily, but yeah.
Right.
So anything else on Syria, Will?
Yeah, I'll just say, like, I kind of gave the Pentagon's position. They came out and accused the Russians of dangerous, provocative behavior, that they tried to ram their vehicle and stuff. But Moscow's position on this whole thing, they've said that, like, hey, dude, we gave you our patrol route. Like, you knew where we were going to be on this day, so like you can't claim that we like tried to accost you or something. You knew we were going to be there. And so that's sort of their position. And it does sort of seem like, in the video, it does seem to show that the Americans were the aggressors. Though I will say that I think the Russians themselves were the ones who put out the footage. And we don't see the whole thing. And so we can probably expect they edited it to make themselves look as good as they possibly can. But, it does still seem like in the footage that we see, it does appear that, like, to back up sort of their account. So that there's nothing definitive there, but yeah, that was the Russians. That was their sort of argument, is that, hey, we told you where we were going to be, and you came and found us.
Right. This seemed to me like one of those cases where there's at least a little bit of fault on both sides, because there is literally endless room for everybody to avoid each other. And,
Right.
I guess maybe one of the things in like the military posturing here is that if you're playing chicken with them and you get them to turn, then you maintained your patrol and they did. I don't know.
Right.
But it seems something stupid like that when, everybody could just driven around this endless area and obviously not run into each other at all, should they have chosen to do that. But they all put themselves in these positions. And again, it's just toying with the lives of the rest of us. With this, I also noticed a similar story come out of South Korea, although this isn't two military vehicles running into each other. It was a U.S. Armored, I believe, personnel carrier ran into a civilian SUV and killed 4 people inside of it, which caused the U.S. to, what they say, suspend training operations in the area. This was some, training thing the U.S. was doing, and it just plowed over this SUV. From my understanding, everybody inside the SUV was killed instantly.
Yeah.
And I guess the interesting thing to me is that, this is, again, it wasn't a big deal. I think they say 4 U.S. soldiers had concussion-like symptoms from the situation in Syria, which, look, concussions could be serious. I'm not trying to downplay that, but everybody's alive. Everybody's fine. Probably got a couple headaches. Syria, or South Korea, 4 people are dead. The amount of nukes coverage that one gets from the other is significant. It's demanded that Donald Trump call Vladimir Putin and explain what the hell is going on in Syria. And yet there's nobody saying that Donald Trump owes a call to Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, to express his condolences for this. We have to stop these training activities. Nothing. So,
Right.
well, I was wondering what you thought about this. I know you actually saw some video of maybe not video, but aftermath of the wreckage, and were able to attest that this was a pretty serious collision.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the car that was involved in this got completely totaled, and the APC was like barely even touched. Like, I think the 2 American soldiers were just fine and went right back to duty, whereas these 4 civilians, I think they're all middle-aged people. They like died instantly. It's not totally clear to me why this APC was on. Like, if you see some of the photos, it looks like it was a freeway, and so it may have been that, like, this was a high-speed collision, that the car may have been going fairly fast. And I'm not totally clear either that it may be that the car crashed into they like rear-ended the APC. But, it's still like, if you have a tank driving slowly down a freeway at night or something, then like that is a major obstacle. You're blocking the roadway there. I'm not totally sure what they were doing in the road. I think a police source told Yonhap News, a South Korean outlet, that they were on their way back to base or something. There was a live fire range pretty close by. So that may have been what they were doing. But yeah, it does seem like, this was rough. This is a really gnarly incident. And yeah, we're not really going to hear much about it. It's not going to be turned into any kind of, incident. Like, I think it's largely probably people just like us who are talking about this.
Right. When I read this story, I kind of imagined the possibility that the SUV had run up on this thing fairly quick or something like that. I don't know how fast, if these things travel fast enough to go like the minimum speed on a South Korean freeway. And
Yeah, I
so
think
if
it's
you
a tracked vehicle. Like, it has tracks.
right. Or and then again, what's like the rear lighting on this thing? If
Right.
you're traveling down a highway at night, I used to drive like from Kenosha to St. Louis when I was in college, and I would do that drive at night a lot of times. And let me tell you something: if a vehicle didn't have lights on in front of it, I think it'd be pretty easy to run to the back of it down
Yeah.
these dark highways at night and stuff like that. And facts could come out later. Maybe the guy was like blitzed out of his mind, and they were all snorting coke off each other and going crazy down the highway, and happened to what like, and that just happened to be what was in the way. But at the same time, you have to imagine if there was an American personnel carrier there, even if they had rear-ended another SUV, it probably wouldn't have resulted in this. But these aren't infrequent that something like this will happen every year. It was within the past year, there was a first claimed to be the wife of an American diplomat, but then later maybe a CIA agent
Oh, I didn't hear that
was,
part. You talking about the
and
UK?
yeah, it was this lady who ran over this kid on his motorcycle, and then
Yeah.
the U.S. sent her back and is refusing to extradite her. There was this drunk U.S. officer in Pakistan who ran over some guy on like I don't know if it was a bike or what you called it. I think it had like a little thing behind it, that he would
Rickshaw
like,
thing or
yeah,
something.
rickshaw thing behind it. But yeah, the guy just ran over, killed some guy in Pakistan. Shrug, no
Right.
accountability, no nothing, about that poor soul. But and again here, this is never even talked about with U.S. foreign policy as like being part of the cost that now these four South Koreans are dead. And things like this happen in Japan too. I remember it wasn't that long ago that I think me and you were talking on the show about the door. I think it fell off an osprey over Okinawa and like landed on or near a school, and could have killed like crushed some little kid to death. You know what I
Right.
mean? These are the things that happen because the U.S. is in so many countries, over 100 countries around the world, and I'm sure it creates a lot of anti-American sentiment. I
Yeah,
sure
no
would.
kidding.
I don't know if I would ever forgive a country that resulted in for my you said these are four adults, so maybe a couple couples or something, but two of my relatives being killed, my friends being killed, it'd be a lot to take. And I wonder, I know there is like feeling in South Korea that the American presence isn't helpful. We've covered protest movements against things like the U.S. THAAD missiles that have been deployed to South Korea. And
Right.
so maybe we'll see some protests and stuff like that. And it seems like the U.S. has, like, again, suspended training, but it's very limited. And it may be just to that live firing range. And my kind of sense was that they didn't want vehicles probably driving past the memorial for these people for the foreseeable future. But
Right.
I don't think it's going to any way change what the U.S. and South Korean relationship is.
Yeah, I didn't get the impression that there's going to be any like wide scale pause of training. I think they just meant, yeah, in this one little area, this one neighborhood or something. And yeah, I mean, like you mentioned Okinawa, there is a lot of precedent there for American servicemen doing wrong. And there's a lot of feeling in Okinawa and Japan of, opposing the American presence. And we may start seeing some of that similar kind of sentiment in, South Korea.
Do you have anything else on South Korea before we move on to Afghanistan?
Now let's go to Afghanistan.
All right, so I got a couple stories here from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com on the U.S. alleging that the Taliban fired a rocket onto a base that houses U.S. soldiers in southern Afghanistan. The U.S. says that this is a violation of the what they call a peace agreement with the Taliban, although I think that's using the word peace very, very generously to call that a peace agreement. The Taliban, for their part, say that they did not fire the rocket and are investigating it. The U.S. in their statement sounded absolutely sure that they thought it was the Taliban that was behind it. and then did call it a violation of the peace agreement. And so, I think that's important because this is, I believe, the first time the U.S. has formally accused or publicly accused the Taliban of violating that peace agreement. And then two big questions that this story raises for me would be, first is that how is it that the Taliban know which all Afghan bases house U.S. soldiers? Maybe it was a well-known base and that's how the U.S. feels that, but I mean, look, there could be U.S. soldiers anywhere, and a lot of these bases are fairly massive, and so I think this rocket landed in empty space. If you got like a big runway on a base or, hangars and stuff like that, there's plenty of room for rockets to land without getting anywhere near anybody. We see this a lot in Iraq, and that seemed to happen again there. And the Taliban, said it wasn't them and that they're investigating it. And so you at least, I know this was southern Afghanistan, which isn't the normal operating area for ISIS. But I would suppose it's possible that, the Islamic State would do something like this because they seem to be really trying to provoke and stir up things in Afghanistan, even with their, far more limited presence in the past year and a half, as the Taliban have done a number on them, along with the U.S. and Special Forces operations. So I was wondering what you thought about this, Will.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned a couple of things that I think, comment on. The first one is that I think the base was sort of a large American base, Camp Bastion. So I think it was sort of like a well-known, a well-known base that housed American troops. And I believe it was also in the Helmand province too. And so that is like sort of the Taliban's their area. So if we were asking like how would they know American troops are there, I guess that might make more sense that they have better intel on a base that it's actually in the Helmand province. But one thing I wanted to ask you, actually, just in terms of to clarify, the last I had seen, all we had on this were 3 anonymous officials telling this to the New York Times that like that the Taliban fired like a dozen rockets, I think, at this one base. Was it just those 3 anonymous officials? Or do we have like a formal statement now?
Well, what kind of seemed to confirm it to me is that the Taliban didn't deny that the rocket attack happened. They seem to feel like it did because they said they're investigating it and trying to figure it out. And so when the Taliban didn't deny the attack happened, I assumed that it did. But that's a good point, is that the sourcing on this, at least from the English side of things, is pretty thin.
Yeah, I was just curious if there was like a formal statement, because yeah, like it is interesting the Taliban denied it too. They even raised the possibility that some breakoff faction that like might be kind of affiliated with them may have done it, I think, and said that we're going to look into that and see like what might have happened. But yeah, as far as I saw, I didn't think there were like the Pentagon. I don't think they came out and formally like announced this and said like, oh, this is a big violation. I think it was just the 3 officials anonymously telling this to the Times that like, oh yeah, this is a so there is I think a distinction there.
Yeah, no, that's an important point because, you say, and I kind of just read it as an official leak, as, the U.S. telling the Taliban that, hey, this is a violation, and just doing it through anonymous source rather than a spokesman. But as we know, like from the Taliban bounty story with, Russia,
Exactly.
there is reason to be skeptical of intelligence coming out of Afghanistan. And so, fantastic point here. Well, I should have really thought about this as I was thinking through this story before, that we really do need to consider the possibility that U.S. intelligence officials put this story in the news. I'm sure there's a couple reasons, but one is obviously to make it less politically advantageous for Donald Trump to remove troops from Afghanistan leading up to the election here. If Donald Trump pulls out all troops now, and Afghanistan gets really nasty, like it might when U.S. troops leave. Not that that's not a reason to pull out U.S. troops, but I will guarantee you suddenly the life of every Afghan is going to be very important to Rachel Maddow should Donald Trump pull out troops. As she will make sure that every single Afghan that dies after Donald Trump, leaves with U.S. troops, that every single one of those deaths, just like every single corona death, is all his fault. I'm sure that's
his name on it.
Right. I'm sure Taliban guy walks into, some building in downtown Kabul and shoots 10 people, Donald Trump's fault. Afghan army blows up a house full of people trying to hit a Taliban camp, Donald Trump's fault. Rogue Afghan special operations unit massacres 10 people because they can, Donald Trump's fault. That one actually would be anyways, but if we left, it would be less his fault, but then, the way they see it, it would be more. I guess my biggest concern with this is that it isn't going to be, the straw that breaks the camel's back on this Afghan peace deal. However, if a President Biden takes office, I think what they're going to do is they're going to roll out the bounty story. They're going to roll out this attack. They're going to roll out anything the Taliban has done in the last 6 months and, the next 6 months, and be like, for all of these reasons, the Taliban haven't met their end of the peace deal, and so we're not withdrawing U.S. troops. So I think that's probably the end game here, is that this isn't necessarily something that's going to turn the tide on the peace deal in the next, a couple weeks. But
Right.
it's going to be, one of those straws when it comes to either a Biden presidency or, it's Trump time to withdraw. Everybody's going to be telling him, you really can't, because the Taliban attacked a U.S. base, and the Taliban are supported by the Russians, and the Taliban are supported by the Iranians. And by the time we get, to January, there's probably going to be 4 more groups on that list. And the Taliban are also going to be doing terrible things to women and children and everybody else to make sure that the U.S. and the American people feel like we can never leave that country.
Right, right. Yeah, I absolutely agree on sort of the optics of just how this could be spun, by a future administration, this type of story. To me, I think there are a couple possibilities with this. Like, I think it is possible that the Taliban did launch this attack and that they're denying it, and that the Trump administration doesn't want to acknowledge it formally because they don't want to screw up the peace deal. Trump wants that for his election chances. So I think that's at least in the realm of possibility. But I think also equally plausible is what you were saying, that like maybe these officials are just feeding this BS to the New York Times to scuttle that deal, because there are many political forces arrayed against the president that would like to see that peace deal fall apart, and people who are ideologically in favor of the war too, who might they might not care about the Trump, but they want to keep fighting the Afghan war. Another possibility is that these American officials, just exactly like we saw with the bounty story, that they were fed BS from the Afghan government, who'd got this from whatever tortured intel that they got out of some criminal or something. So I think there's a lot of different possibilities for what could explain all this. But I think bottom line is we don't have very good indication that the Taliban for sure did do this. And so if they're going to try to use this to like scuttle the peace deal or screw that up, then I want to see much better evidence than what they're currently giving us, what we saw in this Times report.
Right. And I will say, I don't think the Taliban are the same organizationally as, let's say, the U.S. Army,
Right.
where if, Mattis says, under no circumstances does anybody attack Iran, I'm pretty confident that no troops are, no rogue colonel is going to go out there and launch an independent attack on Iran. That
Right.
said, maybe things are a little bit different in Afghanistan, where if some local in Helmand felt wronged by the U.S. government or the Afghan government, he put together this attack on this base, maybe not thinking about the wider implication or doing it to like screw up the deal or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, but that, this could have been somebody who is a Pashtun, or who even is loosely associated as a member of the Taliban, without it actually being a Taliban ordered attack on the United States. So I think there's a lot of room for some different things to have happened here. But from our perspective, the most important thing is that this in no way changes the name of the game, that the U.S. has to get out of Afghanistan as soon as
Absolutely.
possible.
Absolutely, I agree. And just, I guess, one last thing I'd add is you're talking about, maybe there are, some Pashtun group in Afghanistan who's against the deal, and that is exactly what the Taliban commander told the Times. That he said, we didn't do this, but there may be breakoff groups. There are groups out here who don't like the deal that we signed with the Americans, and that they may have that as a goal in mind to scuttle it. So yet another possibility.
Right. And look, I'm sure the Taliban commanders aren't all fantastic people, so maybe they're screwing over some local groups too, with the way the deal is all playing out, where had the
Right.
U.S. continued the war for a little bit longer, maybe it would have allowed other people some opportunity to like carve out a little fiefdom for themselves. And we know Afghan operates in that way a lot.
Sure.
With that, I guess we should be wrapping up here, Will, but I think we have another successful episode to put out for everybody, so I'm really excited.
Yeah.
Just want to plug a few things. If you go to the Libertarian Institute, which is where the show is hosted and set up, you could check out the show notes pages that me and Will are putting together. We will have links in the show notes show notes pages to the Apple Podcast, the iTunes, to subscribe to the show, give it a rating and review, and then links to the YouTube page because it'd be really helpful if everybody could subscribe. The Twitter, if people could follow, and then the Facebook page. Me and Will are trying to make sure that like a lot of our work does end up on those accounts. That way people could check it out. Will, you are a writer over at RT. You are always putting up your stuff at your Twitter handle, the Will Porter. I try to make sure I tweet out my news roundup every morning. I'm at Kyle Anzalone _. Do you have anything else to plug today, Will?
No, I think that's it.
All right. Thanks, Will.
All right. Thanks, Kyle. Take care.